The courtroom felt colder than it should have on a late spring morning. Sunlight filtered through tall, dust-smudged windows, the beams landing on polished wooden benches that had borne witness to decades of human suffering, loss, and fleeting moments of hope. It was the kind of place where hearts were broken as easily as rules bent, where decisions weren't just made, they were carved into the lives of those standing beneath the gaze of men and women in black robes. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as if it, too, was waiting to see whose fate would be decided that day. Among the crowded rows of stiff-backed benches sat a figure who didn't belong. A boy, no older than 17, maybe younger, sat quietly in the last row. His clothes weren't right for a courtroom, a plain, faded gray hoodie with a frayed cuff, jeans worn thin at the knees, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen better days. His hair was too long, falling across his eyes when he looked down at the notepad on his lap, but his expression was sharp, focused, watching everything with a kind of intensity that most people never bothered to bring into rooms like this. His name was Alex Carter. No one knew him there. To them, he was just another kid with nowhere else to be, probably waiting on a parent's hearing, or maybe just a troublemaker come to witness the consequences of bad decisions. But Alex wasn't there by accident. He had waited for this day. This moment. At the front of the courtroom, a middle-aged woman stood trembling in front of the judge's towering bench. She wore a faded blue blouse and a skirt that might have once been part of a cheap department store uniform, her hair pulled back into a haphazard bun. Her face was lined with exhaustion, her eyes sunken and dull, as though sleep and hope had abandoned her a long time ago. She held her hands tightly together, twisting them nervously, waiting for her turn to speak. Case number 472, the clerk announced in a bored tone, barely looking up from her papers. State versus Margaret Langley. Theft in the third degree. Misappropriation of controlled substances. There was a brief shuffle of papers, the prosecutor clearing his throat as he rose. A man in his 40s, polished and self-assured, his expensive suit immaculate, every hair in place. He carried himself with the kind of confidence reserved for people who'd learned early in life that the world often bent to those who spoke loudly enough. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, this is a straightforward case. Mrs. Langley, employed at Whitmore Pharmacy for over 10 years, was caught on security footage removing prescription medication without authorization. Specifically, oxycodone, an opioid controlled by federal law. She bypassed company protocol, falsified records, and took home pills intended for disposal. The state moves for immediate sentencing, as the evidence is irrefutable. The judge, Harold Whitmore. A large man with a face shaped by decades of decisions and indifference, sighed as though the very act of listening to these words exhausted him. He glanced at the defendant, his expression one of mild irritation. Mrs. Langley, he said, his voice gravelly, do you have legal representation present? The woman swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. No, Your Honor. I couldn't afford one. Another sigh. This one heavier. In that case, the court will proceed with. I'll do it. The voice, clear and steady, sliced through the stillness like a blade. Every head in the room turned toward the source. Alex Carter stood, notebook in hand, the words trembling slightly on his tongue but his resolve unshaken. The judge squinted, clearly not believing what he was seeing. Who said that? I did, Your Honor, Alex replied, stepping forward. A collective murmur swept through the room. A boy? Representing someone in a court of law? It was absurd. Whitmore scoffed, leaning forward with a humorless smirk. Son, this is a court of law, not a classroom. Sit down before you make a fool of yourself. With all due respect, Your Honor, Alex said, his voice growing firmer with every word, the law states that a defendant has the right to be represented by counsel of their choosing, or to waive that right and allow a non-licensed individual to assist them, provided the court grants permission and the defendant consents. I request that you allow me to represent Mrs. Langley. There was a long pause. The prosecutor's face twisted in a smug grin, expecting the judge to shut the boy down immediately. But curiosity got the better of Whitmore. He looked down at the trembling woman. "Mrs. Langley, do you consent to this, young man representing you?" Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but the sheer, aching desperation of a mother with no other option. She gave a shaky nod. I accept." Another ripple through the courtroom. The judge sighed. "Very well. But you'll follow the same rules as any counselor, understood?" "Yes, Your Honor." Alex stepped forward. His heart pounded so hard against his ribs he was sure everyone could hear it, but he forced himself to meet the judge's gaze. The prosecutor rose again, still smirking. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor." "Irregular isn't illegal," Whitmore said flatly, his eyes never leaving Alex. "Let's proceed." And just like that, a 17-year-old boy was standing at the defense table, facing off against a seasoned attorney and a judge known for his impatience. Alex cleared his throat, turning to the jury, a group of 12 ordinary people who had never expected to be part of something like this when they woke up that morning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex began, his voice trembling slightly but steadying as he spoke, "what you're about to hear isn't the story you've been told. It's not about a thief. It's not about greed or recklessness. It's about a mother." He glanced at Mrs. Langley, who looked back at him with watery eyes. "A mother whose son is dying." The words hung in the air. The prosecutor objected immediately. "Your Honor, there's been no evidence submitted to support this claim." "Then let's submit it now," Alex said, pulling a thin file from his backpack and handing it to the bailiff. The judge examined it, frowning. It was a collection of hospital records, letters from doctors, and photographs. The kind that told stories without needing captions, the frail boy in a hospital bed, wires and monitors surrounding him, his face pale and thin but smiling despite it all. The judge's expression shifted as he read. "Is this accurate, Mrs. Langley?" The woman nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, sir. My son, Tyler. He's 11. He's been fighting bone cancer for 2 years." A few members of the jury covered their mouths. Even the prosecutor's smugness faltered. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" the judge asked, his tone less sharp now. "I tried," she whispered. "The insurance refused to cover the newer pain meds. The old ones made him sick. The pharmacy wouldn't help. I didn't know what else to do." The judge nodded slightly, motioning for Alex to continue. And continue he did. Alex laid out the chain of events, how Mrs. Langley had exhausted every legal avenue, applied for financial assistance, begged local charities, and written letters to lawmakers. How the medication she took wasn't new stock but expired pills marked for disposal, a technical theft, but one that hadn't harmed a soul and would have eased a boy's pain. The courtroom was silent except for Alex's voice. Each word he spoke chipped away at the walls people had built around their hearts. And then came the moment no one expected. Alex reached into his backpack again and pulled out a letter. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a statement from the pharmacy's regional director, received just this morning. In it, they acknowledge receiving Mrs. Langley's repeated requests for assistance and express regret over their failure to respond. Furthermore, effective immediately, they've instituted a new program to donate unused medication to low-income families dealing with terminal illnesses." He handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Harold Whitmore read it twice. The prosecutor sank into his chair. A thick, tangible weight hung in the air. Finally, the judge set the letter down and looked at Alex with something approaching wonder. "Who are you, son?" Alex straightened his shoulders, the adrenaline keeping him upright. "Alex Carter. I graduated high school at 14. I'm a first-year law student. I passed the bar exam last month." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the clerk's pen stilled. "I came here today," Alex continued, his voice softer now, "because I wanted to see how justice works outside of books. I came because I believe that sometimes, we forget the human beings behind these cases. And I couldn't watch another person get crushed by a system that's supposed to protect them. Whitmore didn't speak for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll be damned, he murmured. He turned to the jury, though he didn't need to. After a brief, almost symbolic deliberation, they returned. Not guilty, the foreman announced. The courtroom exploded in quiet applause. Mrs. Langley sobbed, covering her face with trembling hands. And Alex, his legs suddenly unsteady, felt something in his chest unclench. As the room cleared, Judge Whitmore called him to the bench. You've got guts, kid, he said quietly. But more importantly, you've got heart. Don't lose that. Alex smiled faintly. I don't plan to. And with that, he turned and walked out into the sunlit afternoon, the weight of 100 stories still waiting to be told pressing gently against his shoulders. Because some fights aren't about law or power, they're about kindness. About remembering that behind every case number is a beating heart. And sometimes, it takes one brave voice to remind a room full of hardened people that humanity isn't a weakness. It's the law's only reason to exist. Outside the courthouse, the world seemed softer than it had that morning. The air was still cool, the sun stretched higher overhead, and people moved past each other with the unthinking hurry of ordinary life. But for Alex Carter, everything felt different. The echo of the gavel's final bang still rang in his ears, and his heart carried the weight of what had just happened like a secret too precious to share. He walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the worn straps of his backpack cutting gently into his shoulders. Around him, the city buzzed with indifferent life, car horns, street vendors shouting about hot dogs, distant sirens. But Alex's mind wasn't on the noise of the street. It was on Mrs. Langley's tear-streaked face, on the way the judge's voice had softened by the end, and on how, for one brief moment, the people in that room had remembered how to be human. He didn't have anywhere particular to go. There was no office waiting for him, no congratulatory dinner or article in the paper. The world outside the courthouse didn't know that a boy had stood in a courtroom and changed a life that morning. It didn't know, and maybe it didn't care. But Alex cared. That was enough. As he reached the end of the block, a voice called out behind him. Hey! Kid! Alex turned. It was Judge Whitmore. The old man was out of his robe now, wearing a plain gray suit that made him look smaller, somehow. The lines on his face seemed deeper in the daylight, his eyes tired but bright. He crossed the street toward Alex, moving slower than he had in the courtroom. Alex felt a flicker of nervousness. Had he done something wrong after all? Broken some rule they'd let slide in the heat of the moment? You mind if I walk with you? Whitmore asked, falling into step beside him. Alex shrugged, unsure what to say. Sure, I guess. For a while, neither of them spoke. They walked past office buildings and lunch carts, the scent of grilled onions hanging in the air. Finally, Whitmore sighed. You know, in 30 years on the bench, he said, I've seen a lot of things. But I've never seen anything quite like you. Alex gave a small, awkward smile. I didn't really plan on doing that today. No. Whitmore chuckled, shaking his head. You just happen to carry hospital records and corporate statements around in your backpack for fun? Alex flushed. I'd been watching Mrs. Langley's case. Following it online. Court records are public, you know. I saw how fast it was moving, how no one would take her case because she couldn't pay. So. I looked into it. You looked into it. Yeah. And how'd you get that letter from the pharmacy? I emailed every executive in the company, Alex admitted. Told them I'd show up with the press if they didn't respond. One of them panicked and sent the statement this morning. Whitmore let out a low whistle. Son of a gun. They reached a small park, and Whitmore gestured to a bench. Alex hesitated, then sat. You know, the judge said, lowering himself onto the bench with a grunt, when I was your age, I thought the law was the most important thing in the world. Rules. Order. Consequences. I believed if you followed the letter of the law, everything would work out. Alex studied him. And now? Now. The old man chuckled, but it was a sound tinged with regret. Now I know it's not that simple. The law's a tool, kid. Nothing more. It can be used to build or destroy. It depends on who's holding it. Alex nodded. That's what I'm trying to learn. Not just the rules, but the people behind them. Whitmore watched him for a moment, then pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it over. My office. Tomorrow morning. 10 sharp. I want to talk about what you're going to do next. Alex's eyes widened. You mean? I mean, Whitmore said, standing with a groan, the system chews up kids like you. Idealistic. Smart. Brave. You'll either burn out or become one of those soulless suits if you're not careful. I'd rather see what happens if someone actually teaches you how to fight without losing your humanity. And with that, he patted Alex's shoulder and walked away. Alex sat on the bench a long time after that, the card heavy in his hand. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he took a train to the hospital. It was a long ride, 2 changes, then a 10-minute walk. The air was heavier here, the streets a little quieter, the buildings lined with tiny front yards where weary parents sat watching their sick children play. Alex had called ahead, using a borrowed phone from the courthouse lobby. Mrs. Langley was in room 317, Tyler's room. When he arrived, she was sitting by her son's bedside, holding his small, pale hand. Tyler was awake, his face bright with curiosity. You came, Mrs. Langley said, her voice breaking as she stood and hugged Alex tightly. Tyler grinned. Mom says you saved us. Alex smiled, a little embarrassed. I just did what anyone would have. Mrs. Langley shook her head, tears in her eyes. No. Not anyone. No one else did. They talked for a while, about court, about Tyler's favorite movies, about the stuffed bear he kept on the bed beside him. The medication had already arrived, the pharmacy scrambling to avoid more bad press. Tyler was resting easier now, color returning to his cheeks. Before Alex left, Tyler held out the bear. You take him. Alex hesitated. No, buddy, he's yours. Tyler smiled. He's lucky. He helped me. Now he can help you. Mrs. Langley pressed the small bear into Alex's hand, her eyes shining. Please. So you remember that what you do matters. Alex swallowed hard and nodded. When he finally stepped back into the fading afternoon light, he felt different. Not proud, not heroic. Just, responsible. The city hummed around him, alive with its own stories. On the way home, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Nice work today. Let's see what you do next. Judge W. Alex smiled. At the apartment, his mother was waiting, exhaustion in her eyes but a warm meal on the table. She didn't ask for details. She just hugged him a little longer than usual and let him eat in peace. Later that night, long after the city had settled into its restless sleep, Alex sat at his desk, the small bear beside him, and opened a notebook. He made a list of names, people like Mrs. Langley. People left behind by a system too big to notice them. And in the quiet, he made a promise to himself. One case wasn't enough. Tomorrow, he'd find another. Because there were always more stories. And sometimes, all it took was one person willing to speak up. Even if that person wasn't supposed to have a voice. Yet. The morning light spilled through the thin curtains of Alex Carter's small apartment, a faint glow chasing away the last of the night's quiet. He woke before the alarm, not from restlessness but from a strange kind of purpose that had taken root inside him. The events of the previous day felt both impossibly distant and right there beneath his skin, like a pulse he couldn't shake. The judge's card still lay on his desk, its neat lettering a silent invitation and a challenge all at once. He rose, washed his face in the cracked bathroom mirror, and pulled on a clean hoodie, well, clean enough. The small bear Tyler had given him sat propped against his books, watching him with button eyes. Alex paused, hesitating, then tucked the bear into his backpack. Maybe it was silly, but somehow it felt important, like carrying a piece of that courtroom with him, a reminder of what this was all for. The city was already awake by the time he stepped outside. Delivery trucks rumbled along narrow streets, commuters clutched coffee cups like lifelines, and vendors set up makeshift tables of things no one needed but might buy anyway. It was a city like any other, full of people moving too fast to notice each other, carrying their own invisible battles. And Alex, for the first time in his life, felt like one of them. At exactly 10 o'clock, he stepped through the heavy wooden doors of Judge Whitmore's office. It wasn't what he'd expected. No towering marble columns, no grand portraits. Just a modest, book-lined room that smelled faintly of old paper and stronger coffee. The judge sat behind a cluttered desk, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, reading a file thick with yellowed pages. Right on time, Whitmore grunted, motioning to the chair across from him. Good. Alex slid into the seat, trying to sit up straighter than usual. Listen, Whitmore said, setting the file down and lacing his fingers together. Yesterday, what you did was reckless. Illegal in some places. Dangerous in all of them. You understand that, don't you? Alex nodded. And you'd do it again, wouldn't you? Another nod. In a heartbeat. A slow grin spread across the judge's weathered face. Good. That's exactly the kind of dangerous I've been waiting for. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small stack of case files, sliding them across the desk. You said you wanted to learn how the system really works. Well, it doesn't work in the textbooks. It works in here, in stories nobody wants to tell, in cases that never make the news because they're too small or too messy. Alex's heart pounded as he opened the first file. A father wrongfully evicted after a paperwork error. A teenager facing a sentence far harsher than his offense deserved. An elderly woman fighting to keep the house she'd been born in. I can't officially let you practice, Whitmore said. Not yet. But I can point you toward the people no one else will help. And if you're smart, you'll start learning not just the rules but how to bend them without breaking yourself. Alex swallowed hard, closing the file. Why are you doing this? Whitmore leaned back in his chair, a shadow of something old and heavy passing behind his eyes. Because a long time ago, someone did it for me. And because if you keep going like this alone, one of two things is going to happen, you'll burn out, or you'll lose what makes you worth saving in the first place. Alex's voice was barely a whisper. And what's that? Your heart, kid. Your damn heart. They worked all morning, reviewing case after case. By the time Alex left, his backpack was heavier, his mind spinning with facts and dates and names. He felt overwhelmed, but also, for the first time in years, like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The following days passed in a blur of long hours and harder lessons. Alex tracked down witnesses who didn't want to be found, pored over property records in dimly lit basements, and spoke to families who clung to hope with exhausted fingers. He learned which doors to knock on, which to avoid, and how to navigate a system designed to confuse those who needed it most. And slowly, stories began to shift. The teenager's sentence was reduced after Alex uncovered mishandled evidence. The elderly woman kept her home when Alex dug up a decades-old zoning law no one else remembered. The father was reinstated in his apartment when Alex convinced the landlord's lawyer that a quiet settlement was better than a public scandal. None of it made the papers. No cameras waited outside courthouses. But each time Alex saw the relief in someone's face, felt their gratitude in the way they gripped his hand, he knew it mattered. He wasn't doing it for recognition. He was doing it because no one else was. But not everyone liked what he was becoming. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streets shimmered with the heat of the day, Alex received a message slipped under his apartment door. No name, no return address. Just a single sentence, typed on a slip of paper. Stop digging, kid. Before you find something you can't bury. Alex's stomach turned cold. He reread the words a dozen times, but they didn't change. He thought about going to Whitmore, but something in him, whether pride or fear, he wasn't sure, told him not to. Instead, he slipped the note into the back of his notebook and kept going. The next day, as he prepared to visit another tenant facing illegal eviction, he noticed a car following him. A black sedan, windows too dark to see through. It trailed him for blocks, then disappeared. It happened again the next evening. He mentioned it to no one. Until one night, he arrived home to find the small bear Tyler had given him sitting on his doorstep, its head torn loose, stuffing spilling onto the concrete. His chest ached. Not from fear, but from a deeper, sharper grief. Not because of the threat, but because it meant someone wanted him to stop badly enough to tear apart the one thing he kept as a reminder of why he did this in the first place. He gathered the pieces carefully, cradling the bear's ruined body in his hands, and carried it inside. He didn't sleep that night. At dawn, he walked to Whitmore's office. The old man looked up from his desk, took one look at Alex's face, and sighed. Tell me everything. And Alex did. About the note. The car. The bear. Whitmore listened without interrupting, his expression darkening. When Alex finished, Whitmore rubbed a hand over his face. I warned you, kid. The system doesn't like being exposed. People get comfortable in the shadows. Alex's voice was hoarse. I'm not stopping. Whitmore met his gaze. Didn't figure you would. They made a plan. Tighter precautions. Trusted contacts. Carefully chosen battles. But the fight didn't stop. And neither did Alex. Word of the boy who spoke for the voiceless began to spread, not through headlines, but through whispers in church basements, in overworked clinics, in apartment hallways where families huddled together against the cold. People began to find him. One evening, a single mother whose husband had disappeared 3 states away showed up with 2 frightened children. Another night, a man wrongfully accused of theft when a store clerk mistook him for someone else. Alex took them all. Each time, he carried the memory of Tyler's smile and Mrs. Langley's tears. He thought of Judge Whitmore's tired eyes, and the countless stories written in court files no one read. He won some battles. Lost others. But he kept showing up. Because someone had to. One cold evening, as winter approached and the streets glittered with frost, Alex stood alone on the courthouse steps. The cases had grown heavier, the fights harder. But in the distance, through the falling snow, he saw a figure approaching. It was Mrs. Langley. And beside her, a boy, thinner than Alex remembered, but walking on his own, cheeks flushed with life. Tyler grinned and waved. Alex's throat tightened. Mrs. Langley pressed a small, neatly sewn bear into his hands. New fabric. Same button eyes. I thought you could use a friend, she whispered. Alex's voice cracked. I never stopped carrying the first one. They stood together in the falling snow, a moment of warmth against the cold. Because in the end, it wasn't about cases or courts. It was about people. About the unseen threads that connected strangers, the small kindnesses that left lasting marks, and the courage it took to keep fighting when no one else would. Alex Carter wasn't a legend, or a headline, or a hero. He was just a kid with a bear in his backpack and a promise in his heart. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world. One story at a time.